welcome to The Social Capitalist with host and Never Eat Alone co-author Tal Raz. Social Capitalist events are sponsored programming of myGreenlight, an exclusive online learning platform for relationship development skills. For more information, visit our webpage at www.mygreenlight.com. Enjoy the event.
Hello, everyone. I'm Tal Raz, as you know, and this is the Social Capitalist podcast series. Today, we just experienced a little bit of it: uncertainty, risk, exposure to criticism. Nearly every critical work and life decision is a leap of faith that requires us to grapple with fear, not to mention all the technology that's out there. Those who do this successfully transform that fear into confidence and creativity, taking more leaps more successfully than the rest of us. But how is it done? The answers come to us from Jonathan Fields, who is particularly and personally well-versed on the topic of uncertainty. He gave up a six-figure income as a lawyer to make $12 an hour as a personal trainer. Then, married with a 3-month-old baby, he signed a lease to launch a yoga center in the heart of New York City. He signed that lease a day before 9/11. His book, Uncertainty, Turning Fear and Doubt into Fuel for Brilliance, is his incredibly well-received tome, demystifying creativity with research-backed tools and tactics. I'm very excited to welcome you, Jonathan.
It's great to be here with you.
All right. So, from your biographical sketch, you seem to have led an exciting life of numerous reinventions, entering and exiting different careers, businesses, and doing so with a fair share of success. Of all the lessons and areas of interest to pull from that experience, when and why did you settle on uncertainty?
You know, it's an interesting question, and like you said, I've made a number of fairly major leaps. And one of the things I've discovered is that no matter how much you plan, no matter how much you think you know what's going to happen as an entrepreneur, you just don't. And in fact, the more you plan and the more committed you stay, to that one plan, like this is the way I knew it was going to happen and this is the way it has to happen, the more you miss all sorts of opportunities that would potentially make that original plan of action 10 times better. So I began to really get curious about, what allows certain people to be able to be highly adaptive, to walk away from the need to have to know what's coming next, and in doing so, open up a world of opportunity that so many other people struggling with the answers myself, and I wanted to get a better understanding of what happens in the world, in the mind of entrepreneurs, people in high-level careers, innovators, and artists.
I thought a story of yours was telling. I had actually thought it was a case of Schadenfreude, and that you were, as a lawyer, everyone questioned why you would be going into the wellness industry, and you said you were afraid of being laughed at, and then, come a few months, your colleagues were asking you, how did you pull this off? Did that have anything to do with it?
Well, I found myself working really hard in a field where increasingly I was getting sicker and sicker and less happy. And there's a huge awakening to me. I ended up in the hospital in emergency surgery when I actually perforated an intestine, had a huge abscess in the middle of my body. And I ignored the pain for the better part of a few days because we were on a deal. And it's kind of a wake-up call. When your body physically rejects your career, you have to take a step back and say, okay, what's going on here? But then, like you said, there came a time where I left this to make very little money and learn an entirely new industry that a lot of people with my background would have looked on as and did look on as what a shame. He's doing this thing which you don't need any professional training to do, and you don't make any money. And I took a very different business-like approach to it. And sure enough, as that business started to explode, people did start to circle back and say, what exactly did you do to be able to make this happen? So it was an interesting moment when that started to happen. And it was fun because I love teaching and explaining what I do. So I'm not a secret hoarder. I'd rather just let it all out and let people figure out how to be happy in the world.
Well, you have plenty of examples in the book of people who do this masterfully. Was there one in particular in the early stages where you were, going back and forth? Was this the idea that sort of captured what you had done and what will sort of maximize and leverage your experience for everyone else's benefit? That essentially served as your template? Was there someone whose story encouraged you that with research you could uncover a real process here?
There were, what I found was that different stories uncovered different pieces of the process. There was no one story where I said, okay, now I can basically follow it through and say this person did this, these 10 things, which allowed them to go from point A to point B in a way that would, that would kill most people. But what I found was that there were a number of different stories that really beautifully highlighted really critical practices or strategies along the way. Like the story that opens the book, for example, which is Randy Commissar, who is kind of a legend out in Silicon Valley. He was the head of LucasArts, and then on this amazing track to be the CEO, very likely of a huge multi-billion-dollar company. And he just completely jumped out of a plane and said, this isn't right for me, and created a job and a title that didn't exist in Silicon Valley. And the rest of his story is pretty amazing. But the big piece of the puzzle that came from him, and then was repeated a number of times by other people, was that he pointed to a particular strategy that he credits as being his source, his keel in the storm. Sort of he, at one point, I remember the quote. I said, what allows you to do this? And he said, equanimity is a powerful muscle to flex when you step out into the ambiguous void. And for him, his source of equanimity, of stillness and balance, was the spiritual practice, and more particularly something called insight or mindfulness meditation. And it was interesting to hear him say that, and that particular practice or variations of it started to emerge from the mouths of people that I never would have expected it to. So it was kind of fascinating to see that piece of the puzzle evolve.
Well, so that's actually, at this point, it might scare people to hear this, uncertainty being quite an amorphous topic itself, and then insight meditation. But the refreshing distinction of this book is that you pull all of this down into the trenches and get very tactical. In fact, if no one else gave you a template, you did, in a sense, create somewhat of one and essentially structure the book in that way. So I want to go through some of the major ones. The first is one that involves something that you call certainty anchors. You found a high degree of ritualization in people who handle the unknown well. Tell us about that.
Yeah, and this was really fascinating because when you talk to a lot of the most creative people in the world, they have a knee-jerk reaction against routine. And they'll say, well, I can't be bound, I can't have structure, I can't have all these constraints, I need to sort of be able to freestyle and create and innovate. And then what you find is that it's actually less so within their working lives, but in many of those same people, in their non-working lives, in everything that goes on outside of the time that they're tasked with, saying I'm working, is insanely ritualized. So if you ask that same person who said, I could never be bound like that, well, what did you have for breakfast today? They'll tell you, well, I had a sesame bagel with a smear of cream cheese and a half a tomato and a half-calf latte. And then you'll ask them, well, what did you have the day before that? And you get the exact same answer. And then you start to realize that, probably dozens of small touch points throughout their day have become highly ritualized. And what they've done essentially, and I started to see this as a pattern across a wide variety of people in all careers, in arts, in entrepreneurship. And what it appeared they were doing was essentially creating all these little moments where they're removing uncertainty. They're removing the decision-making element of a lot of the day-to-day decisions. And it's like it had a side effect of dropping all these little certainty anchors throughout the day where they knew what was coming next. And it allowed them enough sort of, creative space to go up into the ether and to take bigger risks and to feel like they were less tethered. During that part of the day where they said, okay, this is my job to go and do things that scare me. So it was fascinating to see that pattern. Everything from, like I said, the most fundamental things like what you wear every day. I mean, classic example is Steve Jobs, who, essentially wore the same thing for decades, to ritualizing the actual work process. So, Steve Pressfield who was a legendary writer and wrote a great book, the War of Art. He sits down the exact same time every day. He places his desk the same way. He incants the muse from Greek mythology before he writes, and that's his ritual. And then he commits to a fixed time where that's sort of part of the way that he frames himself. And what you find is it creates a lot more stillness in people, and it allows them to go to that place where they know this is the time where I have to do the work and take risks.
It's interesting because, all of this is in the service, or much of this is in the service of reducing fear and anxiety. And you cite research that was enlightening to me. I've always assumed, and I've told a story about myself, going way back from, before college to college and after, that, I used anxiety as a fuel, pulling all-nighters, and this is how I got things done. And you, in fact, say that that's totally wrong. We don't, we have this misplaced kind of romanticism with the anxiety around work, and that, in fact, it's inversely correlated with creativity, right?
Yeah, in fact, there's pretty strong academic research. And part of what I was doing was not just to try and bring stories to the fore, but actually base a lot of the stories and then go back and say, okay, what's the research? Where's the academic research that either proves or disproves it? And what I discovered is, in fact, just that research shows that creativity, it has, the higher your anxiety levels ratchet up, the lower your creativity goes. And also, one of the key things for creativity in business is a type of problem solving called insight-based problem solving. So you can solve problems. You can come up with innovative ideas in two ways, either insight-based or analytically based. Now, analytical would be, okay, I have a big idea, and if somebody said, how did you get to that idea? You could explain the steps. You could reverse them back out and tell them how you got to it. The insight-based solution is the one where you have this tremendous idea, but if someone said, how do you get there? You would have no idea. It literally, it's the thing that just comes to you. And what we know, what the research actually shows, is that even, creativity plummets as anxiety goes up. But even more specifically, insight-based problem solving, which is about the highest level of problem solving because it introduces new paradigms, also plummets as anxiety goes up.
Now, isn't that all damning of the contemporary workplace in which, we're getting pinged every 6 seconds with a new email in our inbox and Skype messages, and where are the insight's going to come from there?
Yeah, and exactly. And, what we discovered is that a lot of the way that we work today is completely counter to the demand that we're putting on people. So, these days especially, we're in this time in our economic cycle where we know what got us here, ain't going to get us there. So there's a huge demand for new ideas and huge pressure being put on people saying you need to come up with bigger, better ideas. But it's being done in a way very often where people are incredibly fearful that if they don't do it, all sorts of terrible things are going to happen. And like you said also, one of the huge things that's become a big problem is that we are constantly bombarded with distractions. You start a task, and it's kind of funny. I think these days there's a much bigger awareness that multitasking is probably not a badge of honor to wear. But just a couple of years ago, if you asked, if I was speaking in front of a room of 100 executives and I said, who's a great multitasker? All 100 would want to raise their hands because they felt like, that's a really big asset. But what we know now is that the brain doesn't work that way. We single task and we switch rapidly, sometimes hundreds or thousands of times throughout the day. And so we create the perception of multitasking. The problem with that is every time we switch between a task, there's a cognitive ramping time. Our brain takes anywhere from a few seconds to 15 or 20 minutes to get back up to speed. So we use a huge amount of efficiency, a huge amount of time, and that creates, it ratchets up the pressure on us because now we have even less time to get done what we want to get done. So we have, more anxiety, more fear, and we're trying to balance all of these different things at once. So yeah, you put your finger on it. We're the work environment that we've created is in large part really stifling to the innovation and creativity process.
I saw some study about multitasking that compared the cognitive impairment of multitasking to to people who are trying to do the same kind of work, but after a large dose of marijuana. So
I don't
that's
doubt
actually
it. I mean,
an English study.
Yeah.
So it all makes sense. The second, the first tactic is, first tactic is certainty anchors. The second tactic you talk about, which is no surprise to any of us at myGreenlight, is something you call build your hive. What exactly does that mean?
Yeah, one of the biggest fears that we have in sort of creating on a new level and then revealing it is that we're going to be judged. Fear of being judged is a massive, massive factor. In fact, there's a classic experiment called the Ellsberg paradox where he demonstrated that we basically, our brains are hardwired to want to run from making a decision which will lead us closer to uncertainty. But much more recently, that experiment was repeated in a way where they removed the expectation that people who would make decisions would have to reveal those decisions and be judged by other people. And the bias away from uncertainty essentially vanished. So what we know is that our brains are actually, they're hardwired to a certain extent to want to avoid uncertainty, but they're even more hardwired. There's a social context to it. They're even more hardwired to avoid making a decision in the face of imperfect information and being wrong and then being judged by their peers or their supervisors or anybody else around them. So we're terrified, but here's the problem with that. Judgment, when you break it down, is really a combination of two things. It's emotion and data. And as people who are trying to grow and innovate and be creative, we are desperate for the data. Data is like, manna from heaven for us because that accelerates our ability to do better things in the world. But we don't know how to process the emotional side of it. So one of the things that's been really fascinating for me to observe has been what's going on in the tech world, this the seed accelerator model. And most people know the big two examples are Y Combinator and Techstars. And what they do is they bring in a dozen small founding teams. And you work in this super intense, sort of insane environment for a 12-week window of time. And every week in that environment, everybody is expected to come in and very likely have to completely pivot, not just their platform or the product, but very likely their entire business model, sometimes multiple times in that 12-week window. And every week there's a sort of there's a coming to God moment where every team has to step up and say, this is what we're doing, this is what's working, this is what's not working, and accept input from everyone else. And what they've done there is they've essentially created a dynamic where they've changed the normal reaction to judgment. Instead of being terrified of receiving judgment, they've created an environment where it normalizes the experience of getting this high-level feedback, where everybody, it's all in, it's high transparency, and everybody is going to sort of be exposed to this and to also give it. And in doing so, essentially, you create a dynamic where people become much more open to the data side of judgment, and instead of shutting down and being terrified of being judged, because it's sort of an all-in process. They've created this hive environment where there are certain rules. It creates ideas and a willingness to change and take risks that we rarely see outside of environments like that. So, the bigger lesson is how do we create elements of that within the context of what we do, whether it's in a large organization or in our own businesses.
Actually, that's exactly what I was going to. What's problematic about using Silicon Valley or technology is that the atmosphere, the environment is almost invariably completely different than most people working at most jobs. So, to the last point that you made, how do you do that? How do you create hives in a corporate bureaucracy or a old guard company that you happen to be working at?
Yeah, so what we do is we look to create discrete experiments. And if I'm going into a large organization and saying, hey, listen, we have data, we know this works, and if we create these team-like of things where we don't want to suspend judgment, but we change the environment, the psychology of how it's delivered and received, I would never expect somebody to say, okay, let's change the entire organization. So the approach is, okay, let's create a discrete experiment. So for the next 90 days, we're going to take Team A, and we're going to take Team B. Team B is just going to work the way they always work. Team A, we're going to change the dynamic, and we're going to create subtle changes in the way that they work. We're going to exalt experimentation. We're going to let them know that we want them to create ideas on a level they've never created before, and potentially radically change ideas a number of times through the process, and there will be absolute zero judgment. In fact, there's going to be a high expectation. We will exalt experimentation. We're going to let everybody know that everybody on that team is all in. There will be a weekly reveal. You have to come clean with everything that you're doing. And the judgment that we're receiving, and this is sort of a big thing, is in the name of not creating a zero-sum game where one person on the team wins, and the assumption is that then everybody else has to lose. But what a friend of mine, John T. Younger, who's this crazy sculptor, calls the zillion-sum game, which is the assumption that everybody can win, that I win, somebody on the other side of the transaction wins, and parties who don't even know it exists have the opportunity to win. And so you change the psychology of what you're doing on that team, and you say, okay, listen, we don't need complete buy-in. What we want to do is have a discrete experiment, and then we'll decide on the metrics in the beginning. That can be some sort of a quality of solution type of judge, or whatever the metric is that's important to a particular organization or team, and let's measure it and see if it's working or see if it's not working. And to me, in any large organization, that's always the way you go about doing things. So you give it a time-limited window and sort of a measurement metric, and you say, at the worst-case scenario, we'll come out the same. Best-case scenario, we'll come out far ahead, and then we can take that data and figure out what to do with it.
Great. I just because we have limited time, I'm going to move forward. One of the areas that particularly interested me was I'm one of these kind of quantified self guys, like constantly looking, probably to my own detriment for optimization, physically, cognitively, what have you. And in a sense, that was what this whole section was about. Talking about meditation, exercise. Can you talk about some of those? This goes back to the Randy Komisar issue, why this is important and how it works in.
Yeah, absolutely. So, what I broke it out into is essentially, you can't create anything great without taking action and making decisions in the face of uncertainty. It just doesn't happen. So, problem is we experience uncertainty as massive discomfort, and that shuts us down or moves us too quickly because we can't handle the anxiety of the process. So how can we make changes either in the work environment, the workflow, and we've talked about two examples of those, or what personal practices can we bring into our daily lives that will pretty profoundly change the way we experience being in that state of uncertainty so that we can be there long enough to allow much higher levels of ideas and solutions to percolate up and be okay there and not have it kill us, essentially. And I started looking at these practices, and what's fascinating is that two that came up are things that a lot of people sort of know intuitively are incredibly important, but kind of run from. One, because they're a little freaked out, and two, because they just don't realize that it helps on the level of brain physiology. So the first one is this thing called attentional training, and examples are meditation, mindfulness. And if I was talking, in an organization about this 30 years ago, I would have been laughed out the door. Now I'll go into a large organization, and people are fascinated because, and the huge difference is there is now a huge body of peer-reviewed published research that show that these processes have a really huge impact on two levels. One, practiced on a regular basis, they can dramatically lower anxiety, fear, depression, frustration, and the flip side of that is that they elevate cognitive function, problem solving, creativity. So it's sort of this, it's almost like the holy grail of interventions, but most people started thinking about it, when they first heard it from a spirituality standpoint. Then the next level is people thought about it from a health standpoint. Well, how do I reduce stress and get healthier? Now what we're realizing is that it is one of the most powerful professional interventions on the planet because it completely changes the way that we experience high uncertainty situations, which are the situations we need to be embracing to create extraordinary innovation. So that's one of them. And then you also brought up exercise. Exercise, what we know now, so a lot of people, again, started because of one or two reasons, one of three reasons really. Either A, they just love a particular activity. You're drawn to it, and you do it because you enjoy it. B, because you're trying to stay healthy and lose weight and prevent disease. And C, purely for cosmetics, for appearance purposes. So now what we know is there's a fourth massively important reason for business. It has nearly identical effects as the ones that I just laid out for meditation or attentional training. So what happens is if you combine these two, if you develop a daily mindfulness meditation or meditation practice and a daily exercise practice, those two combine to create, about the most potent creativity, innovation, and performance force multipliers on a professional level on the planet. If you actually take nothing more from this conversation and my book, it would be an understanding of the research that now shows this. And, if you bring these two things into your life, and don't do them simultaneously, by the way, because we don't adopt habits simultaneously. We have to do them sequentially. But incredibly powerful on so many levels, not just personally, but professionally.
So I'm going to, at this point, go between my own questions and some of the questions that the audience is posing for you. One of the questions that's come in, and I'm sorry, Oni, I'm not going to be able to pronounce your last name, but he says he interacts with small business solopreneurs, and he wants to know, how do you go about doing what I assume is the Hive operation, He's dealing mostly with single-person operations, and he wants to know how to get them to buy into that idea and how to create it if they're not an existing group. Great question. And the funny thing is that the answer is a bit counterintuitive, because you would think that that person is actually at a disadvantage, when in fact they're actually at an advantage, because they don't have to fight an existing culture that isn't used to this approach. And now, because no matter where you are in the world, we can technology to essentially find those people who are like-minded, who understand the culture and the philosophy of the Hive. What I've seen a lot of people doing is literally going into social media or finding, similar like-minded business people in their neighborhoods, or maybe in similar businesses, but, because of the internet, they're in non-competitive areas, and literally creating their own groups of people where they say, okay, here's what we're here for. And here are the rules. Here's how it's going to unfold. And I sort of lay out, all the steps that have to be there. Can we get everybody to buy into this? And if so, let's start rocking and rolling. One example that I share in the book actually is it was a small one-person local furniture maker in a small town, middle America. And he couldn't find anybody. He wanted to share ideas and get better and figure out cool new things and talk about tools and shapes and wood. So he went on Twitter and started talking about this stuff on Twitter, then developed a Twitter chat called Wood Chat. It's the hashtag Wood Chat. And it's a weekly Twitter chat where now he's got all of these woodworkers and craftsmen from around the world coming together once a week to form this sort of collaborative Hive type of experience on Twitter. And then he brings them together on his blog. And I think he may now have even created his own sort of private mastermind program around that. I'm not really sure. It's a great question, and the beautiful thing is that these days we can get a little bit creative and tap technology to create our own hives, no matter where we are, even if we're in the smallest of towns and the most single-oriented businesses. So it's a tremendous opportunity to do this, no matter where you are. That's a tremendous example, by the way. And completely doable by just about anyone, not just entrepreneurs. Essentially creating a community of practice through Twitter.
Yeah.
I'm wondering, I was particularly interested in, I'm hard-pressed to say this is a tactical area, but it's one that you call own the storyline. And as I'm researching an article myself now about the power of story to influence how we do just about everything, it can even influence the makeup of our neurochemistry, this was very interesting to me. So talk about how you came to identify this as such an important issue and how it relates to dealing with that fear.
And it was a combination of my own just experience of the things that I tell myself when I'm under high stress situations, and then doing a whole bunch of research. And it's this kind of fascinating merging of common experience and actually cognitive behavioral psychology. So there's this thing in behavioral psychology called cognitive reappraisal, and it's one of the most powerful tools in the arsenal of a therapist. And essentially what it is you're teaching somebody that when they get into a high anxiety state and they start spinning a storyline of doom and gloom, that you create a scenario where you break the cycle of spin, and then you take a step back. You develop some level of objectivity and say, okay, is this the only potential outcome, or is this simply the outcome that I'm latching onto and spinning? And then you ask, most people ask a single question, which is, what if I fail? And then they create a story around that question. That's a pretty doom and gloom story, and they start to cycle it over and over, and it becomes paralyzing. What they never do is ask two other questions, which would allow them to tell two other stories. One is, what if I do nothing? Which, when you get really honest with that question, is very often the much more horrifying answer. And it's much more, instead of it being a paralyzing answer, it's a mobilizing answer. The third one is, what if I succeed? And tell a story around that. And then that gives you the opportunity to create a different storyline, and then keep returning to and embracing and sort of emboldening that storyline. And like what you said, we now know that there's there's a lot of pretty fascinating research around this now, that it's not circumstance so much that determines the way we experience the world. It's the filters and the stories that we tell ourselves about that circumstance. It's why people who are in Bhutan, come up as being the happiest people in the world. Even by Western standards, a lot of people would look at many of those people as being poverty-stricken and having nothing. So it starts out as this sort of a anecdotal thing about the stories we tell ourselves, and then we realize that it's this it's actually a tool from behavioral therapy that's incredibly effective at allowing us to change the stories we tell in our head. The common word for this, by the way, is not cognitive reappraisal, it's reframing. And to reframe the story that we're telling and tell a different one, and that becomes a mobilizing story rather than a paralyzing one.
And you make an excellent point. I think when you talk about stories themselves, that can get overwhelming. When you bring it down to the questions and becoming aware in those moments what questions are creeping up in your own mind, because that is, in essence, is the key to those stories, is what people can focus on to help them deal with that right away. That was the point that I kind of pulled from you. Is that right?
Yeah, absolutely. And one of the keys is to start asking different questions.
Okay.
Because that determines the answer.
From one of our members, William Hortz, asks, he wants to know about specific, what have you found, what pieces of research studies have you found are the most influential, the most effective when it comes to proving your point to corporate leaders and trainers who may be a little bit resistant to some of the stuff that you're talking about?
Yeah, and it's a great question. Fortunately now, there's actually a fairly decent-sized body. A lot of it I actually cite in the book, but there's even more stuff that's not in the book. If you look at work, and what I like to do also is follow, there are a number of big researchers that touch on different areas of this actually write for like HBR, like Professor Teresa Mabile, who has another great book that's just out. She does a lot of similar research around this field. Completely blanking on his name, but guys like people who are coming out of the positive psychology world, like Sean Aker.
And Seligman.
Yeah, yep, Seligman and Barbara Fredrickson. Hardcore researchers, academics, vetted, they publish voraciously and speak voraciously, and they couch a lot of their research in the context of, okay, this is what it means in a business world, and they have great examples.
Well,
you know,
I love... I was just going to say, if you could tell the experiment by Richard Weissman about disempowering the fear of judgment, because especially in the corporate world, where it's all about culture. Go ahead. I'm sorry.
No, I mean, this was incredible. So Richard Weissman was, doing an experiment, and he wanted to try and figure out, is there some commonality? Is there something that people do that makes them luckier or less lucky than people? So what he did is he got two groups of people together, and one group self-identified as being very unlucky. The other group self-identified as being very lucky. And then he sat them all down. He said, okay, here's a newspaper. I'm going to time you, and I want you to go through newspaper as quickly as possible, and count every picture that you see in the newspaper. The people who identified themselves as being unlucky took about 2 minutes on average, and they returned. They said, okay, there are 43 pictures in the newspaper. The people on average who identified themselves as lucky took a few seconds and came back with the exact same number. So you ask, well, how is this possible? And here's the reason why. On the inside front cover of that newspaper, half a page above the margin in 2-inch block letters was a sentence that said, there are 43 photos in this newspaper, stop reading now. And what he discovered was that the people who considered themselves lucky were far more open to actually not just keeping very, very constrained to the instructions and only in the instructions, but seeing things beyond the very narrow blinders of what they were being told to do. Whereas the people who considered themselves unlucky said, okay, I'm going to keep very linear. And they were sort of locked into this certain path of this is what I've been tasked to do. Well, the people who considered themselves lucky said, okay, I'm open to possibilities beyond the immediate instruction. So what he found was that, luck has a whole lot to do with remaining open to things that you didn't expect to happen.
That's an amazing study because it's an indictment of kind of the whole culture of performance reviews and judgment is the only thing that really works.
And also, it's interesting because we tend to measure performance based on, okay, we're at point A, we want to get to point B. How quickly can we get to point B? Who's the person who gets there most efficiently? What we don't look at is, that person may get to point B faster than anybody else, but because of the blinders, because of the refusal to acknowledge other possibilities or opportunities or adaptations along the way, that same person will very likely have missed out on 10 different things that would have brought him not to point B, but to point G had he been open to that. So, how do you measure that? But, we don't look at it that way. We're just trying to figure out, okay, here's the stated goal. How do we get there? Rather than putting it out and saying, we don't know exactly where this is going to end, but our goal is to create the best possible experiences and solutions and products for the people that we serve, and let's work like crazy to just keep doing that.
In this last couple of minutes, so I wanted to review. We've spoken about certainty anchors and creating the rituals around you that provide a kind of oasis of calm. We've talked about building your hive, and we've talked about training your brain, meditation, exercise, and owning the story. One of the areas where I got a little lost was seeing the forest and doing the thing you can't not do. Can you explain that to me and us a little bit more?
Yeah, it's sort of an exploration of, as a general rule, people look at what they do for work on one of three levels: a job, a career, or a calling. And there's some nice research around this. And what we find is that if what you're doing in a given moment is either a job or a career, you are much more likely to not be wholeheartedly committed to the end, but rather being sort of along a process where you're, it's more of an interest. And if the data shows you that as you're going along you were wrong, and it's not going to make you the money or do what you want to do, people will back away. If you feel like what you're doing is a calling, it changes how you exist within what you do. You tend to become far more committed to that thing you do, and very often far more willing to work not for the money, not for the prize or for the power or for the ego, but because this is the thing that you can't not do. And it changes the psychology of the process. It working from a sense of calling, what we see, allows people almost a sense of this is what I'm here to do. So they're more comfortable going to that place and working, not knowing how it's going to come out, because they know deep down that regardless of how it ends, this is the thing that I have to be doing.
So that's fascinating, and it relates to something that I guess now it puts in another light how you hate when, or hate's a strong word, but in the personal development world, all this talk of life's purpose you find to be a sort of a terror.
I do. I don't buy into it. I believe there's the occasional 6-year-old who hits the planet and knows I'm going to be a veterinarian, or I'm going to be this person. But for the vast majority of the people, our purpose sort of reveals itself over a period of many decades, and becomes a lot clearer looking back than it is looking forward. And it becomes this huge, crippling thing, because so many people in the personal development world say, well, step one is you've got to identify your life purpose, and then you can actually take action on it and know that you're doing the right things for the right reasons. But most people can't do that. So I think a much more intelligent way to go about it is to say, okay, rather than dealing with this big, massive question that I very won't likely be able to answer in an intelligent way. Think about it. Most people who get married say that this is the person I want to be with for the rest of my life. I'm 100% sure, and we have a over 50% divorce rate in this country. So things change. Your life purpose should be the thing that stays consistent for your whole life, if that's truly what it is. But people can't generally do that. So it becomes this action-stifling thing rather than a mobilizing thing. So to me, a much more intelligent way to go about it is say, okay, what are the qualities of working life that allow me to come alive? What's the type of culture that I come alive in? Who are the people that I love to be around, to serve under, to serve with? What is the mission of the type of organization that really vibes with me? What are the specific types of tasks, activities, and processes allow me to become absorbed and enter that state of flow? And what's the actual physical setting, that allows me to really just come alive? And then when you break it down to these categories, it becomes much easier to look at the world of opportunities before you and say, okay, I see pieces of all of these different things in these different possibilities, whether it's entrepreneurship or a career path or something like that. And it's a much more mobilizing tool, and to me, a much more practical and effective tool. And what it does is it starts to get you doing work where you're most aligned with the things in your life that allow you to come alive. And through doing that work over a period of years and maybe decades, maybe a much bigger purpose will become revealed from that way. But I think approaching the process that way, to me, is a much more humane, and mobilizing way to do it.
Jonathan, unfortunately, that will do it. Our time is up. I think this is terrific work. I think it has a practitioner's pragmatism, given that you're a serial entrepreneur and you yourself have experienced all this, but also a theoretical basis and research to back most of your tactics and insights that is a rarity in this category. So I want to congratulate you on that and express my gratitude for taking the time to teach and share with us.
Oh, it's been my absolute pleasure. I thank you so much for having me on.
And could you just tell everyone where they can go to connect with more of your work, more of you, find out what's the latest with what you're up to, all of that stuff?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, my home base online is jonathanfields.com, where I blog and sort of share everything. And the book it's called Uncertainty: Turning Fear and Doubt into Fuel, and it's available pretty much everywhere. We put together a trailer which has been incredibly well received for it too, and that's at theuncertaintybook.com.
Thank you so much, everyone who's watching and listening to all this. Thank you all. I'm looking forward to your feedback. You can all connect with me on Twitter at TallRoz or on LinkedIn. Again, thank you, Jonathan, and until next time, bye-bye.
Thank you for joining us. For transcripts of this program and a schedule of our upcoming events, please subscribe to our blog at blog.mygreenlight.com.